Hello, AP World History. We are now going to cover the end of Unit 3, recovery from the horrible ravages of the plague begins in both Asia and Europe. And some important things happen here that I want to make sure that you're aware of during this time. First of all, the recovery in China. The Yuan dynasty, remember the Yuan dynasty was a Mongol dynasty set up by Kublai Khan, and it collapses in 1368. The first Ming emperor is Hongwu. You can see here he is wearing yellow, which is the imperial color, the official imperial color, starting with the Ming Empire. The Ming Empire had a really important interest in eradicating the influence of the Mongols and re-establish centralization of the Chinese Empire until 1911, when the last emperor, who was a Qing emperor, was deposed. They once again used mandarins and eunuchs as they had back in the time even of Qin Shi Huangdi. And as you recall, mandarins are kind of like people that go out into the countryside and help administer the affairs of the empire, and the eunuchs were people that lived and worked with the emperor himself. It was during the time of the Ming Dynasty, actually, that the Forbidden City was built. Economic recovery begins, irrigation is expanded, porcelain, silk, and textile production goes into full swing, and of course, cultural revival takes place. This is going to be really important for the Ming Dynasty to re-establish the importance of Confucianism as really a central tenet of who they are, that ordering of society, the patriarchy, and everything that comes with Confucianism. And again, all of this is to eliminate the Mongol influence that had been there for over 100 years. Foreign populations were quartered in port cities. So what does this mean? You know what? The Ming, the Chinese, were tired of having foreigners in their land. After having the Mongols there, they made the intentional decision that there would be port cities, and these would be the cities that foreigners would be able to be allowed to trade in, that they could not infiltrate and live in the towns and communities of China. Now keep this in mind, put a little star on this one, because we're going to see that China's isolation ended up backfiring on itself. Now, what happens in Europe? First of all, Europe is rebuilt based on two things: taxes and armies. And this is important to remember as well. Taxation would allow for rebuilding of economies and also for the armies to develop. The Italian states of Milan, Venice, Rome, and the Papal State, which would be where the papacy is, the Vatican, were particularly strong states at this time. France and England were going on to fight their 100 Years' War. Basically, France and England were fighting over who should take predominance in the region, either France or England. This time would bring an end to feudalism and the rise of states and important cities. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella achieved the Reconquista of Spain in 1492. What this means is Granada, which is in the south end of Spain, just across the Gibraltar Strait to Africa, they were able to push out the last remnants of Muslims that were in Europe at that time. And of course, 1492 is an important date because, as you know, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and yes, Ferdinand and Isabella intentionally invested in Christopher Columbus at the conclusion of the Reconquista. This is a picture from this time, and you can see that you still have the biblical imagery. You have Peter, who has the keys of the kingdom. You have Jesus. You have Greco-Roman style of architecture being demonstrated in this. This is a time of the Renaissance. The Renaissance began in Italian city-states with the just the Renaissance in all kinds of things, in arts, architecture, painting, science, etc. Basically, what the Renaissance meant is rebirth of classical Greco-Roman culture. So if you go back to Greece, remember Spa, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, you think about Rome and you think of the sophistication of the Roman cities and the aqueducts and the architecture. That's what the point of the Renaissance was. They rediscovered classical texts and monastic libraries. Now, this is kind of cool. Those monks, they've been sitting at the desks and they've been writing for years and years, and they had been rewriting texts from ancient Greece and Rome, as well as Arabic texts as well. And so these were rediscovered. It was like a wealth of knowledge that they were able to recover. They were sponsored by the city-states the Renaissance was. So many city-states sponsored artists to create great works of art or sculpture. Art is one of the primary areas that we see some huge change. We see in this picture linear perspective. Linear perspective is a perspective where there is a vanishing point. You can see that this is further back because of the height on the plane of the visual field, because of the vanishing point, etc. So now we're seeing 3D depth, unlike the Byzantine art that we saw earlier that was flat. Additionally, sculptors created natural and realistic poses, and so we see many, many beautiful sculptures from this time period. If you are ever fortunate enough to travel to Europe, it is abundantly clear that the Renaissance created a lot of great works of art. Architecture was reflected in Greco-Roman style. This would include the columns that you see here that were common in Greece. It would include the arches and other features of Roman architecture. Domed cathedrals became the kind of the symbol of the growing church, or the influence of the church, and even the wealth of the church. Domes are not easily achieved, and as you know, the Hagia Sophia was a huge dome cathedral in Constantinople, and you will see these kinds of cathedrals recreated across Europe. Now, humanism. Here's a guy, he just looks like a really fun guy to party with. Note the sarcasm. This is Desiderius Erasmus. He was a humanist. Now, the humanism at this time was going back to classical history, literature, and philosophy, and it was a Christian humanism. So it's not like we think of humanism now, which is really oftentimes very secular or at least agnostic in origin. This was Christian humanism in which one could lead a morally virtuous life and engage in the world. So rather than some of the monks that we saw in previous times where people would have to be highly, highly aesthetic, and they would have to give away all of their worldly goods, they would not be able to engage in marriage or family. Now the Christian humanists would say, no, it's okay to have marriage, to have business, but to do it in moderation. So as I mentioned, this is clearly not the same as today's secular humanism. Now we have the Europeans adventuring through the Indian Ocean. Next unit we'll talk about the Europeans heading across the Atlantic Ocean into the Americas. But the motives for European Indian Ocean exploration were God, gold, and glory. In other words, to missionize, to find wealth, and hey, to be the one that said, I did it. The other thing is that they could avoid the Muslim middlemen and trade. So remember, the Silk Road would go across China and go through Muslim lands, in through Constantinople and up into Europe. And they were able to get a lot of money as middlemen, and the Europeans didn't want to do this anymore. And so it actually caused a decline in the economy for the Muslim lands and an increase in the wealth of the Europeans. They also but the slave trade did start to become more common for Europeans at this time. Some of the first voyages, long-distance voyages, were taken across the Indian Ocean, as you can see from this map. Now, a few important people to know. In 1488, Bartolomeo Diaz sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, which is the bottom tip of Africa. He didn't make it all the way to India. It would be Vasco da Gama who would jump up the coast of Africa, and end up sailing all the way over to India. In the 16th century, and we'll talk about him a little bit more the next time, Magellan takes off and will sail around the world, except Magellan doesn't actually make it back. He kind of gets in a scuffle in the Philippines, and yeah, it didn't work out so well for him. But we'll talk about him more in the next unit. And Portuguese gunships attempt to maintain a trade monopoly, especially here in the Indian Ocean. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next unit, or a lot more actually. But what's important to note here is as Europe is recovering, European imperialism in Asia begins. That means that Europe is trying to take over control of various parts of Southeast Asia, the islands, India, etc., to take over control either politically or through their economy. This is a picture of Zheng He's treasure ship versus Columbus's caravel. Now, Columbus had a ship about this size. Zheng He's treasure ship and the treasure ships of the Chinese were much, much larger, about 300 feet long. As you can see, these were huge. Now, when you think of the Chinese Navy now, do you think, wow, the Chinese have a great Navy? Nope, I don't. Well, I think they have one aircraft carrier now. Well, the deal was they ended their Navy during the Ming Dynasty. But let's talk about their own age of exploration. This man here is Admiral Zheng He. Now, Zheng He was an interesting dude. He was a eunuch, but he was not made a eunuch until after puberty. So he was quite large. He had reached full-grown height of manhood, and his voice was lower because he had been allowed to reach puberty. He led 7 massive naval expeditions from 1405 to 1433 across the Indian Ocean. Some people, the reason I have 1421 here is there's a book written called 1421. Some people even believe that he might have made it all the way to the Americas in 1421. His voyages were ended due to a few reasons. First of all, Mongol threat. Now, how would the Mongol threat affect Ming exploration in the ocean? Well, they needed to divert their resources from the sailing vessels to the Mongol borders. They needed to spend their money on agriculture. And so the ships were abandoned, the maps were lost, and all we're left with is a little bit of evidence of Zheng He's voyage. And that is it for this unit. Thank you very much for listening.